It's Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi. We'll do the best we can, as always, but this one is a little slightly more challenging, so we do the best we can, and we go slowly to try and understand. And we're on the bottom of Chaf Vav Amud Beis 26b. Gemara is discussing the idea that if a Nazir had designated money for his sacrifices, so this Nazirite has taken money and he's placed it on his sacrifices. He's taken, let's say, $1,000, and he said, this money will be for my offerings. And then, or he uses the exact language that the Gemara allows, and then the owner dies, the person who had designated that money. Then the Talmud had said that such money will be taken to be used for voluntary offerings, zipul and adava. But if he had separated that money for the sin offering that he has to bring, the Ola offering, and the Shlamim offering that the Nazirite brings, then the money has the mixture of the chatos mixed in with it, and he can't bring it as an offering. It's the mechatos murevasbo, and then the money has to be tossed into the Dead Sea, and you can't use it, so to speak. So the Gemara then had said on yesterday's daf that this money that was what's called ma'os sisumin, this money, this law that it goes to Nadava is only if it's ma'os sisumin, only if it's money that was collected as general. But if it had been money that had been something that was not clearly currency, not very easily converted into currency, well, such a thing is the law of Yipul and Nadava will not apply to. So, for example, if it was an animal that was designated to the temple, but didn't have a blemish on it, so then you can't bring it, you can't turn it into money until it gets a blemish on it. So it's not easily currency. Or if it was a block of metal, or if it was a beam, these are considered to be not money because they're not as easily translated into money. And so therefore, the law is that this principle that it goes to a voluntary offering if the owner dies doesn't apply. So now on 26b, 6 lines from the top, the Gemara records the position of, the Gemara says the following, El Me'ata. So then the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, says Rav Shimi bar Ashi to Rav Papa, my taimao de Rabbanan. What's the reason why the rabbis say that it goes to a voluntary offering if it's money situmin? The Amri Maus v'lo behema v'lo naska Maus v'lo savar, that they say it has to be actual currency and not an animal and not a block of metal and not Maus v'lo savara, money, and not a beam. Excuse me, but if that's the case, it should also be El Me'ata Maus v'lo ofos. It should also be money and not birds. Here, the birds most likely refers to the two birds that a person brings for certain sacrifices. Let's say a woman after she gives birth, if she's poor, or a zav or a zava, these are, or mitzora. So if a person, so the law of Moses Sumim should not apply in that case, where a person had designated money for these two birds but had not yet specified them. These two birds are identical, but you'd have to designate one for an oil, one for a chatas. So the law shouldn't apply there. In the case where the person had set aside money for that and then died, that money should not be considered Moses Sumos that goes for Nidava, but rather it should be considered like Mos Mefurashos. V'chiteiman, if you want to say that's the case, Hachinami, Elahada Amar Rav Chisda, what did Rav Chisda teach? When Rav Chisda said, Eina kinin misparashos ela ibil kichas balam ibesias going. Rav Chisda taught that these two animals can never, that the only time you could designate one of the birds as an ola and one as the chatas is either when the owner purchases it or when the Kohen takes it to be the sacrifice. Those are the two times and the only times that you can designate it. And the Gemara and the question that Rav Shimon bar Ashi is saying to Rav Papa, if you're saying that the birds are not going to be considered money and therefore they're not going to be considered within this halacha of the Ma'os Sisumin, well, if that's the case, if that's the case, why do we say that the birds are not included in this halacha? Why do they go to a nedava if we're saying that the birds are not included in this halacha? Why would you say under those circumstances that Rav Chisda is saying that under these circumstances the kinam will go to a nedava? It's a law Moshe Sinai is that it has to be money. But these birds, we're going to say that they are like mifurashim. Since we don't know which will be for chatas, which will be for an olaf, the owner dies, the law will be that the ophos go to death because they have chatas that are mixed up with it. And according to Rav Chisda, who says that they should go to an nedava under those circumstances, even though, by the way, our text of Rav Chisda doesn't actually say that, but this is the way Tosfos is reading it. That Tosfos is reading it that says that Rav Chisda is saying that under these circumstances, that these birds are not going to be considered misparashos under these circumstances. If the owner sets aside money for it and then dies, that the money is considered susumin and not misparashos. If the birds are not money, then why is it going to Nadava? The bird should be like Mepharashas and the money should have to go into the sea. Amai, Harmos Kamir. This law only applies to mos and not to birds. So the Gemara answers, the Gemara says, no, he's the proper response of Shimi as follows. He says, no, you're misunderstanding. The bird case is similar to something else, because even though he didn't specify for which one, there's a special rule, because he says, what about the following case? So Tamech, Haditanan Rashbag Omer, Hevi Shalosh Behemos, V'lo Piresh. Let's say a person brought 3 animals to the temple. The Nazir brought the 3 animals he has to bring. What are the 3 animals? A male lamb for an olah, a female lamb for a chatas, and a male ram for a shlomim. So let's say he brought 3 animals. Now the low piresh, and he kept it. He didn't specify which one is for which. Obviously, the one that's for the chatas is going to be brought as a chatas. The male lamb will be brought as an olah, and l'shlamim tikrav shlamim, and the ram will be brought as a shlamim. But why is the Kohen able to do that without the owner specifying it? Your source also already said that the animals need to be specified. You just said that if you just bring an animal and it doesn't have a blemish, it's going to be like sesumim. So therefore, we're going to assume that it is that the Kohen has the right to designate it there because it's obvious what the case is. And so too in this case here also, Hasam Amarlei Hasam. In this case of the birds, the Torah is telling us that the Kohen has the right to specify it. That the Kohen has the right to specify it under these circumstances. And so therefore it's going to be considered like the Kohen has that right. And here too, you're not going to assume that the Kohen can possibly mess it up because it's clearly so obvious. So therefore, you had tried to say that if he designates birds and not money, that money and not birds, and therefore it's going to be considered like it's mifurashas. But what about the case that we say that the birds are not like mifurashas, that the Kohen could designate them? And you had tried to ask a question on us from that, and we said no. The case of the birds is different because we have a verse that allows the Kohen to do it, just like we see other circumstances where it's obvious and the Kohen has the right to designate on behalf of the owner. That's the mahalach of the Gemara, at least the way I understand it. If you want to do a rebuttal afterwards, I'd be happy to hear it. So now the Gemara goes back to this question. Masev Rav Huna. So I'm going to challenge this question. Do we really say that an animal, we had said that the case that this law that it goes to Nadava only applies where you had designated money. And if you had designated but there are 2 types of animals you could designate. If you had designated an animal that did not have a blemish on it, then we're going to say that it was mos mifureshes. It was money that had been designated. And then if the owner dies, then we're going to say that it cannot go for a voluntary offering because that animal needed to have a blemish on it before it could be redeemed. Whereas if it was an animal which has a blemish on it, you said, I have to bring, let's say, $1,000 worth of sacrifices to the temple. And so you brought some animals as your currency, you brought them, you set aside them, but those animals have blemishes on it. Well, that is currency because that you could sell right away. So then we're going to say that's like Moses Suman. So the Gemara says, or do you really want to say this? Do you really want to say that the animal has a blemish? And if you set aside animals with a blemish, it's like Moses Suma, that it's like money that has a collected without being separated. It's just currency. Do you really want to say that? Tashma. So the Gemara says, but we have a difficulty with this from the following brisa. The brisa is very long, so we'll see what we do from this brisa. If we see, and we'll see how we deal with that. So we have the following case. Let's say, so we're going to get to this. We're going to get to this idea in a little bit, but the point is that under certain circumstances, if a father had set aside sacrifices to bring for his Nazirus, and then the father dies, the son is able to bring the father's sacrifices in his place as a Nazir. But when do we say this? When do we say that this man can use the sacrifices? When do we say that a man can use the sacrifices of that his father had set aside from the money that his father had set aside for the purpose of Naziros? When do we say that a son can use this? Only in the circumstances where both he and his father are Nazirites. And the father set aside money for his Nazirus. The father set aside the money. But the father didn't say, of this $1,000, the father didn't say 300 for the Ola, 300 for the Chatos, 300 for the Shalom. He just put it all together. Umeis, and then the father dies before he brings the sacrifices. And after the father dies, the son says, he says, I will be a Nazirite on the condition that I could use my father's money, because that's the only reason why he's becoming a Nazirite. So then we're going to allow him to do it. But if the son had already accepted the Nazirus before, then we're not going to allow him to do that money. Then we're not going to allow him to do it. And so let's say the son had already been a Nazirite, and then the father separated them, and then the father had became a Nazirite, separated money, and then died. Then what do we do with that money? Hayuo Moses Sumos, if he has money that he had not specifically designated, Yipul in the Dava. Then the money goes to an Dava. This is the same rule we've already seen, with the wrinkle now that if the son had already been a Nazirite, he could use that money for his. If son had not been a Nazirite, accepted a vow, he could use that money. But then let's say the father separated animals, and he specified which animal will fit with each sacrifice. Let's say he separated animals for specific carbon. He said chatos tamus. So he separated, let's say, a female lamb for a sin offering. Well, that the father is dead. Once the father's dead, you can't use that. You can't bring his sin offering anymore. So that animal has to die without being brought. Ola, if he separated a male lamb for an ola, tikra of ola, it's brought as an ola. Shlamim, if he separates a ram for a shlamim, yikarvu shlamim. So we see from Rav and Rav Nuna says, we see from this brisa that most sumim goes to a nedava, that only money. But if father had set aside animals, that would not be the case. And don't we see from here, it says in Rav Hamnuna, my love, afiu balasmum, that even if the father separated animals which have a blemish on it, isn't it the case that even under those circumstances, we're going to say that the animal that is considered not like currency, and therefore the animals are not brought as in the dava? So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about here, when we say this law is by a tamima, that if the animals are pure, and so therefore they're not currency because they have to wait for them to get a blemish, so it's not convenient. Of a balas movement, so Gemara says, well, that's the case if he separated animals which have a blemish on them. Kastuma damya, you mean to say that it's like the animals are satuma, and it's like they are money, and then it goes to an adava? Well, if that's the case, ma'ir yamos, why does the Tana have to say this law with respect to money? Lema haisa behema balasman. Why doesn't he say if it has an animal with a blemish? Yipu and a dava. So why does he give an example of money? Gemara says, well, that's what he's saying. Yeah, that's what he's saying. If the animal has a blemish, then it's basically, why is he sanctifying it only as currency? And the currency goes to that. It's the same thing as money. It's basically currency. So the Gemara now challenges a different question on Rav Nachman, that an animal which has a blemish is going to be considered like its most system, like its currency. So Rava challenges this idea from Rav Nachman, from a Mishnah in Krisus, that if a person is obligated to bring a sin offering, and he separates an animal for this sin offering, and he dies, and also his son has to bring a sin offering, and then the son is not going to be able to bring the animal that his father had separated. The son cannot, so a person separates, let's say, a female lamb as a sin offering, and then he dies, and the son also has to bring a sin offering. The son cannot use his father's sin offering. Not only that, let's say a person designated an animal for a sin offering for one sin that he did. He cannot bring that animal for a different sin that he did. Even if he ate this non-kosher meat, let's say on Sunday, and then on Sunday night, Sunday afternoon, he designates an animal for that sin offering. And then Monday, he goes ahead and eats the non-kosher, a second time he eats non-kosher meat. He can't bring that sin offering for Monday's eating. The sin offering that he separated has to be strongly connected to the sin that he committed. That teaches us a very important concept. When it comes to atonement, you have to have a strong connection with the sin. You have to know specifically what your sin was in order to possibly repent for it. So what's the reason? Where do we learn this law from? It says karbano. It says if a person, this refers to, the source for this is, it says with respect to a prince who sinned, it says if he becomes known about his sin that he made, he brings his karban. The Nazir has to bring a male goat. And from the word karbano, we learn the karbano who yotzei ve'eno yotzei b'karban aviv. He only can fulfill his obligation with his own sacrifice, but not the sacrifice of his father. And so therefore the son cannot use as an atonement the sin offering his father. Let's say, so the Bryce is very long. So again, we can't lose track of what we're starting to say. We want to know, we're challenging this idea that a behema with a blemish is going to be considered like it is currency, that an animal with a blemish is considered like it's currency. So therefore, we're in the middle of this brisa. I might think when it says you can't fulfill your sin offering with the sacrifice of your father, that's talking about a case shehifresh min hakala chamura or min chamura hakala. That's only the case where the sin that his father separated was a minor sin, and he has a more severe sin. You know, what's a minor sin? What's a more severe sin? Maybe a more severe sin is one where there's death from human court, and minor sin is death from heavenly court. Or from a major sin on a minor sin. I might think that if the two sins are of the same value, then you can transfer the sacrifice. Says the verse, karbano. It says it twice to teach us karbano yotzei ve'eno yotzei b'karbano shalaviv. He can only use his father's sacrifice. He cannot use his father's offering. Yachol lo yotzei b'karban aviv behema shehefresh afil min hakala. I might think, okay, he can't use his father's animal that he separated even if it's the same level, because a person cannot use, even if his father was a Nazirite, when he was a Nazirite, he can't use his father's sacrifices. But I might think he could use his father's money, even from the stringent one to a lighter one. Because we have a special law by a Nazirite that if his father had set aside money and then he became a Nazirite on the basis of using his father's money, he can't use it. So I might think if his father had set aside money for a sin offering, he can use it. And when can you use a Nazirite's money? Bisman shehein sisumin v'lo bisman shehein mufurash. And you can use the money for the Nazirite only in a case where the father had not specified which goes to which. Says the verse, Talmud karbano, bekarbano hu yotzei ve'eno yotzei bekarban avim. No, you can only use your own money. You can't use your father's money. We're at the top of 28a. Yachol yotzei b'mo shehifresh. I might think I can't use my father's money. Afilo. But I might think he could use his own money. his own carbon. Talmud Lomar. So I might think you could use your own animal from a stronger sin to a lesser sin. Says the verse. I might think you could use your own animal for the same level of a sin. It says the verse, Karbano, Chataso, Achie Karbano, Lishum, Chato. It has to be the exact sin that you separated for. Im hifresh behema al chelev vehevi al adam or al adam vehevi al chelev sherei lomal velo kiper avayoti b'mal shefresh la'atzom min hakal hakal min hachamura chamura or min hachamura hakal min hakal chamura shekein im hifresh la'atzom malos min hachelev vehevi al adam vehevi al chelev sherei mal kiper. I might think that basically the Talmud is saying, and we're going to go into this in more detail when we do this is tomorrow's daf, but when we do tomorrow's daf, we'll go into the specifics. But I might think that you could use the money to transfer from one sin that you made to another sin that you made. Says the verse, so you have to use it specifically for the sin that you made, and you can't transfer it from one sin to another sin. Anyway, this is the question. What's he asking? What's the question that Rav is saying from this price on Rav Nachman? Remember that Rav Nachman said that the animal that has a blemish on it is considered like Mos Sisumim. So we see from here, Katani Mias Behema, it says in the Brisa that an animal of a Nazir that he separated for his own sacrifice, his son is not able to bring it for his own Naziris. And this is only by Mos Sisumim. And do we see Ma'alav Afilu Behema? When the Bryce gives that example, isn't even talking about a case where the animal has a blemish and we're saying it can't be transferred from the, so we're saying that the son can't transfer it to his own Nazir. So the Gemara says, no, it's not talking about, we're talking about a tamima. We're talking about an animal that doesn't have a blemish. But if the animal has a blemish, what will we say? Because stumas dummy. So we were saying it's like money that was satuma. So if that's the case, we ask the same question. So why does it have to say money? It could have said an animal that is with a blemish, as his father said. And the Gemara gives the same answer. But that the money is, that the value is the money. But the upshot of all this, let me just summarize, because I know it's very difficult and challenging to keep track of it. It's the first time you're seeing it. First of all, we'll repeat this in tomorrow's daf. But the basic point, the Gemara is saying that a person, Rav Nachman had said, that money, that an animal with a blemish is considered money. And the Gemara challenged that question, and the Gemara basically rejects the challenge. But to me, the message of this, the overriding message of this is, if you have money that you have not yet designated for a sin offering, then that money can be, under certain circumstances, used for a voluntary offering. But if the money has been specified for a specific sin offering, it can never be transferred, ever. It can never be transferred, never. And the point is, the whole notion of atoning for a sin doesn't make sense by piggybacking off of, like double dipping onto a different sin. Each sin, in order for it to have any value as an atonement for a sin offering, requires your own focus on trying to repair that sin. You can't repair for a sin in a general manner. A sin requires specific. Let's say, I know it never happens to any of us, but let's say somebody did something to anger their spouse. Let's just say it would never happen, but let's say you got your spouse annoyed with you. If it ever should happen, probably nobody on this thing did it ever happen. And then you say to your spouse, listen, if I ever did anything wrong to you, I'm sorry. But you did something wrong. You did something very wrong. The spouse told you to put the dishes in a specific place, and you didn't do that. You didn't do that. So now the spouse is upset. And the spouse is saying, you put the dishes in the wrong place. And you said, listen, I'm not sure what I did, but if I did something wrong, I'm really, really, really sorry. And the spouse is going to say, you're an idiot. I'm upset about what you did with these dishes. You're talking to me about how you're sorry in general. It doesn't make any sense. So if that's the case, when we're talking about something insignificant like the spout, like where you put the dishes, how much more so when it comes to something where you're pouring your heart out before Hashem Yisbarach, and you're saying, I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to really improve this aspect. Look, I was eating non-kosher. I need to be a better Jew. I'm going to eat the kosher. That makes sense. I'm not going to go into that McDonald's anymore and eat that food. That makes sense. But if you say, listen, God, I'm a new person. I don't know what I was doing wrong, but I'm a new guy. This is all good. It's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. And so that's why this sin has to be a strong connection. That's the teaching of the Daf Yomi for today. And then we should spend a lot more time, and we'll go over it again tomorrow to understand exactly how it fits into the language of this text. You had a question? So I'm going to stop the recording if people have questions. Yes.
It totally defeats the purpose of what people